When a routine traffic stop turns into a career-defining moment, a police officer's worst assumptions collide with a truth he never saw coming. His target? The man who holds his future in his hand. The evening sun cast long shadows across Sacramento's quiet residential streets as Marcus Thompson guided his black sedan through the familiar neighborhood. After 14 years with the Sacramento Police Department, with the last 6 spent in internal affairs, Marcus had learned to read situations before they fully developed. Tonight, however, he was simply a man driving home after a long day at headquarters, looking forward to a quiet evening with his family. The light ahead turned yellow as Marcus approached the intersection. He slowed his vehicle, coming to a complete stop as the signal shifted to red. In his rearview mirror, he noticed a patrol car pulling up behind him, its occupant barely visible through the tinted windshield. Marcus thought nothing of it until the red and blue lights suddenly erupted behind him, followed by the sharp wail of a police siren. Marcus pulled over to the curb, his jaw tightening slightly as he watched Officer Derek Mason step out of the patrol car. Mason was in his early 30s, with close-cropped hair and the swagger of someone who believed his badge gave him unlimited authority. Marcus had encountered officers like Mason before, both professionally and personally, and he could already sense where this interaction was heading. "License and registration," Mason demanded as he approached the driver's side window, his tone curt and dismissive. There was no greeting, no explanation for the stop, just an immediate assertion of dominance that made Marcus's experienced eye take notice. Marcus reached for his documents with deliberate, measured movements. "Good evening, officer. May I ask what the reason for this stop is?" Mason's eyes narrowed as he studied Marcus through the window. "You rolled through that red light back there. Didn't come to a complete stop." The accusation hung in the air despite both men knowing it wasn't true. Marcus had stopped well before the line, but he chose not to argue the point immediately. "I see," Marcus replied evenly, handing over his license and registration. "I was certain I came to a full stop, but I understand your concern for safety." Mason took the documents but didn't immediately return to his patrol car to run them. Instead, he lingered by the window, his gaze becoming more scrutinizing. "You seem pretty calm for someone who just got pulled over. Most people get nervous when they see these lights." Marcus kept his hands visible on the steering wheel, a habit born from years of understanding how these situations could escalate. "I believe in staying calm and cooperative, officer. It makes these interactions go more smoothly for everyone involved." But Marcus could see that his composure was having the opposite effect on Mason. The officer's posture shifted, becoming more aggressive as if Marcus's calm demeanor was somehow suspicious or challenging. "Step out of the vehicle," Mason ordered suddenly. "Is there a specific reason you need me to exit my car?" Marcus asked, his tone remaining professional despite the obvious escalation. Mason's hand moved closer to his service weapon, a gesture that wasn't lost on Marcus. "I don't need to give you a reason. Step out of the car now." Marcus complied, slowly opening his door and stepping onto the sidewalk. He was impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit, his appearance professional and non-threatening. Yet Mason seemed to view everything about Marcus as suspicious. His clothes, his car, his calm demeanor, even his articulate speech. "Hands on the hood," Mason commanded, pointing toward the front of Marcus's sedan. Marcus raised his hands slightly, keeping them visible. "Officer, I've been completely cooperative. What exactly are you looking for?" "I'll ask the questions here," Mason snapped, his voice rising. "You just do what you're told." As Marcus placed his hands on the hood of his car, he could feel Mason's hands roughly patting him down, the search more aggressive than necessary. Other pedestrians on the quiet street had begun to notice the commotion, some stopping to watch from a distance. "You carrying any weapons? Drugs? Anything I should know about?" Mason asked, his tone suggesting he expected to find something incriminating. "No, officer, nothing illegal." Mason stepped back, clearly frustrated that his search had yielded nothing. "You seem to know a lot about police procedure. You been arrested before?" Marcus turned to face him, maintaining eye contact. "No, officer, I haven't been arrested, but I am familiar with police procedure." "Yeah? And how's that?" Mason's voice carried a mocking tone. as if the idea of Marcus having legitimate knowledge about law enforcement was absurd. Marcus paused for a moment, considering his response carefully. He could end this interaction immediately by revealing his position, but something told him to let it play out a little longer. He wanted to see exactly how far Mason would take this. "I work with law enforcement," Marcus said simply. Mason laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the surrounding buildings. "Right. Let me guess, you're a security guard somewhere? Think that makes you one of us?" The dismissive tone in Mason's voice revealed everything Marcus needed to know about the officer's character and motivations. This wasn't about a traffic violation or officer safety. This was about power, prejudice, and the assumption that Marcus couldn't possibly be anything more than what Mason's narrow worldview allowed him to imagine. "Something like that," Marcus replied, choosing not to elaborate further. But Mason wasn't satisfied with the non-answer. He stepped closer, invading Marcus's personal space in a clear attempt at intimidation. "You know what I think? I think you're lying. I think you're just another—" Mason caught himself before finishing the sentence, but the implication hung heavy in the air between them. Marcus had heard that particular tone countless times before, had seen that look in officers' eyes when they thought they could say anything without consequence. "Another what, Officer Mason?" Marcus asked quietly, reading the nameplate on the officer's uniform. Mason's face flushed slightly, realizing he'd been about to cross a line that even his position couldn't protect him from. Another smart mouth who thinks he knows more than he does. The save was weak, and both men knew it. Marcus nodded slowly, filing away every detail of the interaction for the report he would inevitably have to write. "Officer Mason," Marcus said, his voice taking on a different quality, still calm, but with an undertone of authority that made Mason pause. "I think it's time you knew exactly who you're dealing with." Marcus reached slowly into his jacket pocket, making sure his movements were visible and deliberate. Mason's hand immediately moved toward his weapon, but Marcus remained calm and controlled. "I'm reaching for my identification," Marcus said clearly. "My badge." He pulled out a leather wallet and flipped it open, revealing his internal affairs shield and credentials. The gold badge gleamed under the streetlight, and Marcus watched as the color drained from Mason's face. "Detective Marcus Thompson," Marcus said, his voice now carrying the full weight of his authority. "Internal Affairs Division, Sacramento Police Department. Badge number 2. Mason stared at the badge, then at Marcus, then back at the badge as if it might disappear if he looked away. His mouth opened and closed several times without producing any sound. "You want to explain to me, Officer Mason, why you pulled me over for a traffic violation that didn't occur, why you escalated a routine stop into an unnecessary confrontation, why you searched me without probable cause?" Mason stumbled backward, his bravado evaporating instantly. "Detective Thompson, I didn't know. I mean, you were just what?" Marcus's voice remained level, but there was steel beneath the calm surface. "Following procedure, because in my 14 years with this department, I've never seen procedure that includes profiling, intimidation, and unlawful search." Mason's face had gone completely pale now, and sweat beads were forming on his forehead despite the cool evening air. "Sir, I was responding to reports of suspicious activity in the area. I thought—" "You thought what, exactly?" Marcus interrupted. "That a black man in a nice car in a good neighborhood must be up to something illegal." The question hung in the air like a challenge. Mason opened his mouth to respond but seemed to realize that anything he said would only make his situation worse. Marcus closed his badge wallet and slipped it back into his jacket. "Officer Mason, you've just provided me with a textbook example of everything that's wrong with policing in this country. Racial profiling, abuse of authority, escalation without justification, and a complete disregard for the rights of the citizens you're sworn to protect." Mason's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Detective Thompson, I made a mistake. I'm sorry." But Marcus wasn't finished. This wasn't just about an apology. It was about accountability and the changes that needed to happen within the department he dedicated his career to serving. "Sorry doesn't undo what just happened here, officer. Sorry doesn't address the systemic issues that made you think this behavior was acceptable. And sorry certainly doesn't help the countless other citizens who've been subjected to this kind of treatment without having a badge to protect them." Marcus paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. But this can be a learning opportunity, for you and for the entire department. Mason nodded frantically, clearly desperate to salvage what remained of his career. Yes, sir. Absolutely. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. Good, Marcus said. Because you're going to be hearing from me again, Officer Mason. Not as the man you pulled over tonight, but as the head of the division responsible for ensuring that officers like you either learn to do better or find new careers. Marcus walked back toward his car, then turned for one final observation. You know what the most troubling part of this entire interaction has been, Officer Mason? Mason shook his head, looking like a man who'd just realized he'd stepped off a cliff. It's not that you profiled me based on my race, though that's inexcusable. It's not that you abused your authority, though that's also unacceptable. It's that you did all of this without ever considering that I might be someone with the power to hold you accountable. You assumed I was powerless, and that assumption revealed everything I need to know about your character and your fitness to wear that uniform. Marcus got back into his car and started the engine. Through his open window, he delivered one final message to the shaken officer. Report to Internal Affairs tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. sharp. Ask for Detective Thompson. We're going to have a very long conversation about your future with this department. As Marcus drove away, he could see Mason in his rearview mirror, still standing on the sidewalk, looking like a man whose world had just collapsed around him. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. Mason had stopped him thinking he was targeting an easy victim, but instead had encountered the one person in the department with the authority and mandate to address exactly this kind of misconduct. The next morning, Marcus sat in his office reviewing Mason's personnel file. It painted a picture of an officer who'd been allowed to slide by despite multiple complaints about aggressive behavior and questionable stuff. 3 separate citizens had filed complaints about Mason in the past 18 months, but each had been dismissed or minimized by his supervisors. Marcus picked up his phone and dialed Chief Rodriguez's direct line. Chief, it's Marcus Thompson. We need to talk about Officer Derek Mason. I had a personal encounter with him last night that I think you need to hear about. 20 minutes later, Chief Rodriguez sat across from Marcus's desk, his expression growing more serious with each detail of the traffic stop. This is exactly the kind of behavior we've been trying to address, the chief said after Marcus finished his account. But having it happen to you, Marcus, this gives us an opportunity to make some real changes. Marcus nodded. That's exactly what I was thinking. This can't just be about disciplining one officer. We need to use this as a catalyst for department-wide reforms. Over the following weeks, Marcus worked with Chief Rodriguez to implement a series of changes within the Sacramento Police Department. Mason's case became the centerpiece of a training program focused on implicit bias, de-escalation, and community relations. The officer himself was suspended pending a full investigation, with his future in law enforcement hanging in the balance. But Marcus's efforts extended beyond just punishment. He worked with community leaders to establish new oversight procedures, implemented mandatory bias training for all officers, and created a civilian review board with real authority to investigate misconduct complaints. 6 months later, Marcus stood before a packed auditorium at the police academy, addressing a group of new recruits about the responsibilities that came with their badges. The uniform you wear doesn't give you power over others, he told them. It gives you the responsibility to serve others. Every interaction you have as an officer is an opportunity to build trust or tear it down. Every decision you make reflects not just on you, but on every officer who came before you and everyone who will come after. He paused, thinking about that evening on the Sacramento street that had started this journey. You will encounter people from all walks of life, all backgrounds, all circumstances. Your job isn't to judge them or assume you know their story. Your job is to treat every person with dignity, respect, and fairness. Because the moment you forget that, the moment you let prejudice or assumptions guide your actions, you've stopped being a peace officer and started being part of the problem. In the audience, Marcus noticed several officers who'd been part of the reforms, taking notes, their faces reflecting the seriousness of his message. The changes hadn't been easy. Some officers had resisted, others had transferred to different departments, but the culture was slowly shifting. After his presentation, Marcus was approached by a young black recruit who reminded him of himself 20 years earlier. "Detective Thompson," the recruit said, "I just wanted to thank you for what you've done. My little brother was stopped by police last month, and for the first time, he came home talking about how respectful and professional the officers were. That means everything to families like mine." Marcus smiled, remembering why he'd chosen law enforcement as a career path in the first place. "That's why we do this work," he replied. "Every positive interaction, every moment of respect and dignity, that's how we build the kind of police force our communities deserve." As Marcus walked back to his office, he reflected on the journey that had started with Officer Mason's misguided traffic stop. What could have been just another example of police misconduct had instead become a turning point for an entire department. The work was far from finished. Changing institutional culture was a marathon, not a sprint, but progress was being made. Mason himself had ultimately been terminated from the department after the investigation revealed a pattern of biased policing that couldn't be overlooked. But even his case had served a purpose, becoming a teaching tool for other officers about the consequences of letting prejudice guide their actions. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from his wife. "Saw the news story about the Community Appreciation Award. So proud of you." He smiled, thinking about how that seemingly routine evening drive home had led to recognition from the very communities the police department served. The award wasn't for him personally. It was for the changes that had emerged from one man's willingness to hold his colleagues accountable and work for systemic improvement. That evening, as Marcus drove through the same Sacramento neighborhood where he'd been stopped by Mason, he noticed a different dynamic in the streets. Officers were engaging with community members in positive ways, helping elderly residents with groceries, walking with young people instead of viewing them as threats, treating every interaction as an opportunity to build trust rather than assert dominance. It wasn't perfect. There was still work to be done, still hearts and minds to change, but it was progress. And sometimes, Marcus reflected, progress started with one person refusing to accept the status quo, one interaction that revealed the truth about what policing could and should be. The badge on Marcus's chest felt heavier these days, not with burden, but with purpose. Every day brought new opportunities to ensure that the oath he'd taken to protect and serve meant something real for every citizen, regardless of their race, background, or circumstance. As he pulled into his driveway, Marcus thought about the young officers he'd spoken to that day, the community members who'd thanked him for his efforts, and the changes that were slowly but surely taking root throughout the department. Officer Mason's traffic stop had been intended to assert power over someone he'd assumed was powerless. Instead, it had become the catalyst for a transformation that would impact countless lives for years to come. Justice, Marcus had learned, wasn't just about punishing wrongdoers. It was about creating systems that prevented wrong from happening in the first place. It was about building bridges instead of walls, fostering understanding instead of suspicion, and ensuring that the badge represented protection for all citizens, not intimidation for some. The work would continue tomorrow, and the day after that, and for as long as Marcus wore the badge. But tonight, driving through streets where trust was slowly being rebuilt between police and community, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: genuine hope for the future of law enforcement. 3 years later, Marcus received a letter that would remind him why this fight mattered so much. It came from a young college student named David, whose father had been stopped by police the week before. "Detective Thompson," the letter read, "My dad called me last night to tell me about his traffic stop. For the first time in his life, he said the officer treated him with respect, explained everything clearly, and even apologized for the inconvenience. My dad is 58 years old, and this was the first positive interaction he'd ever had with police. He wanted me to find out who was responsible for training these officers differently. When I looked it up, your name kept coming up. I just wanted you to know that what you're doing is work." My dad slept better last night than he has in years. Marcus folded the letter carefully and placed it in his desk drawer, next to dozens of others like it. These stories reminded him that every policy change, every training session, every difficult conversation was worth it. The ripple effects of that night with Officer Mason continued to spread. touching lives in ways he was only beginning to understand. Later that month, Marcus was invited to speak at a national conference on police reform. Standing before an audience of law enforcement officials from across the country, he shared the story of his encounter with Mason and the transformation it had sparked in Sacramento. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he told the assembled officers and administrators, "but it does happen when we're willing to look honestly at our failures and commit to doing better. The badge we wear carries the weight of history, both the good and the bad. Our job is to ensure that future generations inherit a legacy of justice, not injustice." After his presentation, Marcus was approached by officers from departments across the nation, each sharing their own stories of transformation and challenge. The conversation that had started on a Sacramento street corner was now echoing in police stations from coast to coast. As Marcus boarded his flight home, he thought about Officer Mason, who had struggled to find work after his termination but had eventually enrolled in a community college program focused on social work. Even Mason's story had become part of the larger narrative of redemption and second chances that Marcus tried to promote. Not everyone deserved to wear a badge, but everyone deserved the opportunity to grow and change. The plane lifted off, carrying Marcus back to Sacramento, where tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to build bridges, and new chances to prove that justice and compassion could coexist within the framework of law enforcement. The work was far from finished, but with each passing day, the vision of truly equitable policing seemed a little less like a dream and a little more like an achievable reality. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Change happens when we're willing to have difficult conversations and hold ourselves accountable for doing better. Subscribe to Black Story Life for more stories that challenge us to examine our assumptions and work toward a more just society. Because sometimes, the most powerful moments come when someone finally sees us for who we truly are, not who they assumed us to be.